Welcome. We are the Mental Barbell, your go-to resource for everything mental performance. We're here to talk about sports psychology, and everything in between. Welcome to the ultimate mental performance journey. Welcome to the Mental Barbell. My name is Ian Reardon, and my co-host here is Anthony Carnevale. Anthony, how are you?
I'm doing great. How about you?
I'm doing very well. We got some big news coming out of your world, Anthony. You got some announcements to make here to the Mental Barbell universe.
Yeah, really exciting stuff. I was recently, well, I don't know how recently, but I was hired at my old undergrad institution as I think the official title is psychologist athletics focus, but it's mostly sports psychology work that I'll be doing over there. So really excited to be back and working with the student athletes at well, not college now, but the university because we just changed our title recently.
Okay,
So a lot of
awesome.
big changes over at Marist.
Absolutely, yes. I'm sure the student athletes over there will appreciate your expertise and all the experience you've gained working with athletes. So very exciting, very happy for you. And we will, as always, continue to be a resource for you to bounce ideas off of.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yeah. So, in addition to that exciting news, we had the Super Bowl recently, this past weekend. There were some very exciting sports psychology kind of moments. So, we'll talk about those in a second. But Anthony, were there anything? Was there anything that really stuck out to you during the Eagles Chiefs game?
Yeah, I think just how big of a blowout it was. It was the first thing that really came to mind. Congrats to the Eagles fans, I suppose, because got to comfortably watch the game in the second half at least. But what I think you can just notice it when in those blowouts, there always seems to be a stark difference in, I'm not sure if the word's energy, but just like body language, I think too, is something that would stick out too. So, when the Eagles are coming off the field, we're celebrating, there's high fives, there's a lot of communication. The Chiefs seem to be, shoulders a little slumped. We're not walking as confidently as maybe as we did throughout the regular season. And I think all that, as annoying and maybe as corny as it seems, it does affect how you're going to perform. It does affect, and it is contagious, as you could see. That excitement on the defense can excite the offense and vice versa.
Yeah, absolutely. And your point there is really important. I think about the difference between that Super Bowl game for the Chiefs and those regular season games, right? When you're winning, your team's kind of pumped up, full of confidence. You have a lot of that, that hero syndrome, right? That like nothing can stop us mentality. And then all of a sudden, you find yourself down in a big game, and you don't have that wind in your sails, right? You don't have that confidence. And I think what you're saying is spot on. You hear the sportscasters always talk about this team has the momentum right now, and it's momentum is just a word that encapsulates a lot, right? It's all those things that you said. It's how players come off after a play. What are guys doing sitting on the bench? How is the coach interaction going? If those things are trending positively, then the team has that kind of group flow, that group confidence. But if things are tipping the other way, you just see a deflated team. And I think that's what we saw a lot of times, especially over, on the Chiefs bench. I was watching, Travis Kelce a lot before he touched the ball. I think maybe he touched the ball in the second quarter.
Mm.
But before that, he's just sitting on the bench, quiet, kind of staring at the ground. And like you said, players around you see that. All those actions have a ripple effect. So, it can really impact the outcome of a game. And if you're not prepared for that moment, it can really kind of catch you on your heels.
Yeah, and I think, your opponents see it too. So you're giving them fuel to the fire as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So it all compounds, right? All the momentum for one team and against the other. It's a snowball effect. Can really lead to that blowout, like you said. I thought there were, just listening to, as I mentioned, the sportscasters. Tom Brady had some interesting insights. He had mentioned just the mental toughness needed, especially from the Eagles team. He also mentioned the poise of some of the players, especially those skill position players. And then there was also a mention of a mental skills book, which I think is awesome. I believe it was one of the Eagles coaches, had the book called Inner Excellence by Jim Murphy, which is, something straight out of our field, one of those kind of foundational books for mental skills development. So it's really cool to see what we do in our field really getting accepted in those elite sports fields. And as you mentioned earlier in our conversation before the camera, there's no one better to recognize those things than someone like Tom Brady. So very cool hearing some of our industry keywords mentioned there, and hopefully athletes took heed of that, because that is those are important skills for elite performance.
Yeah, I think with I don't know if we're going through like a boom, but like a boom of sports psychology and psychological services with athletes. I think we're starting to bridge the gap between what they're doing and what we're doing.
Mm.
'Cause I think a lot of the times we're all doing the same things. Poise gets talked about a lot, and pressure and confidence, but we can bridge the gap on how to develop that. So it's really exciting to be able to see that. We're building bridges, not barriers here.
Yeah, absolutely. And in my in my experience working with athletes, I think a lot of people leave mental skills development up to just kind of accident, or maybe not accident, but incidental development, right? Like, you are mentally tough because of the things that happen to have happened to you.
Mm.
Whereas what our approach is, let's go and take an active role, teach the mental skills before you have those adverse, situations, because without the right training, you might not overcome adversity, right? You might succumb to it. It might be overwhelming to you. So, just having that intentionality behind the mental skills development, I think is awesome to see at the professional sports level, and I'm excited to see it trickle down into high school, college, youth sports, and really seeing that benefit for all athletes.
Yeah, absolutely. I think mental skill when we talk about mental skills training, you wouldn't just go into the gym and bench press the whole time, or you wouldn't just go and do curls. Just like in mental skills training, we don't want you just to come in and not know what you're working on. So I think when we talk about skills training, we don't want you to just focus on one thing. I think a tailored approach that kind of goes over the whole entire mental skills training. What does it look like? How do you even practice mental skills? Is all something that I think we can help with and help get the word out.
Yeah, yeah, 1,000%. And one of the other things that I actually just saw in the news this morning was that there were rumors of Travis Kelce retiring, and then that's another phase that I think if you're unprepared for, it can catch a lot of athletes off guard. One of the most common things that I run into just when I introduce myself as a mental performance coach is people talking about how much they struggled once they moved on from their athletic career, their athletic identity. Um, I don't know if the rumors are true or not, but I thought it was an interesting segue to go from, or to talk about going from being a professional athlete, a household name, one of the most visible athletes on the planet, to then retiring and kind of fading maybe into less visibility, right? So closing the door on the athletic identity is a it's a part of being an athlete, right? Every athlete at some point kind of closes the door on their competitive career, and with this mental skills training, you might be more prepared for that moment.
Yeah, I absolutely. I think it definitely will help with that. I also think with athletic retirement, it's a process. There's Sports provide a lot of things for the athletes. And one of the big ones is like the structure and the routine. They take up a lot of time. If any athletes are listening, I'm sure you could remember how much time you dedicated to practice, to games, to film, and how much time that would take up throughout your week. And now when that's gone, how do we spend that time? We're talking, depending on your level, like 40 hours a week, maybe more, maybe less. And I think it's important to remember or recognize like there's transferable skills that come from being an athlete. So, your time management, your stress management, communication, leadership, goal setting, these all transfer over to to life outside of sport as well. So when you're transferring from an athlete to what many are calling a NARP, I think is the term for a non-athletic regular person,
Yeah.
or whatever definition or term you want to use for it. Just remember that there's plenty of things that you did as an athlete that transfer to life outside of sport.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're kind of speaking to those preparations that you can make leading up to a retirement, or to that athletic identity shift. I think that's great. And a lot of that, comes from the research, right? There's a lot of really, really robust research in identity management theory, and how, it's easier to transfer identities and transfer skills from one identity to another rather than completely kind of moving on from one and kind of reinventing yourself, right? You can be an athlete in a boardroom, absolutely, with some of those mental skills that we talked about.
Yeah, love that.
And speaking of research, as we are research-based practitioners and try to do everything with the evidence in our support, we always are watching for new research. And out of China actually just came a new 2025 study looking directly at these mental skills and a very unique uh, performance outcome, which is flow. Came from a very famous book. I can link it down in the description. I will not try to pronounce the author's name, but
Yeah, it's a tough one.
the flow state really is this peak performance zone of performance of competition that we strive to find as mental performance coaches. So these researchers, Du, Zhu, and Wang, they took about, let's say, 120 athletes through a mental skills, and they called it a psychological intervention cycle, but they trained them on a lot of the mental skills that we talk about. Things like, ability to handle adversity, goal setting, fear of failure, fear of success, things like that. And then on the back end, they tested these athletes on their flow state. So how readily available was that zone of peak performance for them? They found some great outcomes that pretty much across the board, athletes do find that flow state easier after the mental skills intervention. So after they've been taught about sports psychology principles. I did think there were some other interesting findings that were relevant to the different types of sports and how important flow state is for different sports. The researchers found that basketball and soccer athletes showed the highest flow state, whereas ping pong or table tennis players, running sprinters and swimmers had tended to have a moderate level of flow state, and then weightlifters, which is a very short competition time, right? A weightlift a couple of seconds, so they had the lowest flow state. And so that's interesting just in the context of the importance of finding that flow state in different sports. Um, Anthony, did you have any comments on any of that?
I think the soccer and basketball make a little sense. There's not a lot of stopping in both sports still, depending on how the game's going. So it's easier to maybe find a flow state when you're just kind of constantly moving, getting the flow of the game, for lack of a better term, down. And as a former basketball player, I think it does make sense that, it's easier to get into a flow state, especially when you're touching the ball while you're getting the ball, while you're moving, you're part of the game constantly. Whereas like powerlifting, maybe your flow state preparation needs to start much earlier than it does in other sports. So, like, how does your mental preparation look like before big events? Does that help you get into a flow state, or is it making you more anxious and performing less than ideally?
Right. Or, even that flow state is so truncated, right? If you're doing a snatch, it takes all of a second and a half.
Mhm.
So you might not be able to recognize it, but, I can certainly, and I actually we have a post on our Instagram post, of a Soviet weightlifter talking about like the white moment where the bar kind of becomes weightless and you don't really feel it. You're just executing a movement. And that in and of itself is a flow state, right? It's that white moment. I encourage anyone listening to go and find that because it's an interesting idea. But it might just be harder to recognize a flow state in those faster sports, whereas basketball is a more prolonged experience, and so you might be able to recognize it more readily.
Mhm.
Yeah. Um, yeah, and so kind of shifting into our main topic here, and I will link that research down below if anyone would like to look at it. I also posted a short review of this on our social media pages, so go ahead and check those out if you are interested. Uh, One of the kind of enemies of flow, right, is performance anxiety, right? It's one of those things that can really pull you from that place of peak performance and pull you into a place of worry, stress, anxiety. And so, what we thought we'd talk about today is some just information about performance anxiety, where it comes from, what it is, how to recognize it, and then maybe some tools to address it. So if any athletes out there are struggling with performance anxiety, I would highly recommend you keep on listening. So Anthony, I'll kind of pass the mic to you and let you talk a little bit about performance anxiety.
Sure. Yeah. So I think when we talk about performance anxiety, maybe a good starting point is discussing like what's the prevalence look like. And so we're not going to have data on everybody, every athlete, but at least for the NCAA, their data showed that 30 to 60% of the athletes experience performance anxiety at some point. So over half in some cases, but at least a third. So what does that look like in real numbers? That's 156 to 312,000 student athletes experience some sort of performance anxiety. So I think one, it's unfortunate to see that many people experience it, but on the other hand, we can normalize that. I think being maybe anxious before a big performance isn't necessarily a bad thing. We'll get into that a little bit later. But to also just normalize and validate your experiences as an athlete, that it's okay to be a little nervous before games. We don't want you to be nervous to the point where you're inhibiting performance or inhibiting movement. And we can talk about that as well. But I think performance anxiety, there's so many different definitions out there, and we have a few that we're going to bring up today and talk about. One of them being from a research study in 2019 defined performance anxiety as refers to the anxiety that people experience in anticipation of and or during important tasks, resulting in impaired performance. Okay, so keep these in mind as I read through them because I think there's going to be a lot of similarities between the definitions. So the next one is from a 2009 study that said an unpleasant psychological state and reaction to perceived stress concerning the performance of a task under pressure. And the last one we have from 2021 is the sentiment of worry when an upcoming situation is perceived as threatening by the individual. So what do all these have in common is that it's future-oriented thinking that seems to be an anticipatory thing of performance anxiety. And our anticipation of the event, it is often grounded in a fear of the event or fear of not performing to our best ability. And I think when we look at it from an evolutionary perspective, that makes some sense. Our brains aren't necessarily there to keep us happy, as maybe some of us already recognize, but they're there to make us feel safe. So that fear response is a safety response, not so much a happy kind of response in terms of the performance anxiety. So, like we were saying, why does it occur? It's always future-oriented thinking. So anticipation of a stressful event, the fear of failure, perception of the event, managing expectations that we're setting for ourselves. As you can see, the reoccurring theme here when defining it and thinking about why does it occur is that it's future-oriented thinking of the event. And I think a really interesting piece that I'll connect the dots a little bit with this. I don't know if anybody of our listeners know of Adam Grant. He's an organizational psychologist, wonderful person within the field of psychology. He's wrote many great books. He has a great podcast. I think one of the truly great researchers and thinkers of our time. He talked about in one of his podcasts a research study that was done with professors trying to get tenure, and they thought that if they didn't get it, it would ruin their career for the next 5 years. So when they revisited them 6 months later for those who didn't get tenure, they were fine and back on their feet within 6 months. So the point of me bringing this up is that we're really bad predictors of the future. Like future casting is not a strength of a human being. So when we think of performance anxiety and stress and perception of an event that hasn't happened, we're often going to be a bad predictor of the event. So in basic terms, it's not really productive or helpful to start thinking about the event in a negative way because we're not good at predicting the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you brought up a couple of really good points that I'd like to point out, or to reiterate, I should say. Um, I love the idea of the prevalence that you brought. As you said, it's not great that so many people struggle with performance anxiety, but what's comforting is that a lot of people struggle with performance anxiety. So in our model of behavioral change, right, you have awareness, acceptance, and action.
Mhm.
Performance anxiety is one of those that I think athletes are aware of. It's kind of hard not to be if you get very, very stressed out over and over and over when it comes time to perform. So I don't think the awareness part is necessarily a problem, but acceptance is huge because to address a problem, you have to accept that it's a problem that you're not going to fight against, right? Like if you're trying to resist performance anxiety, that's not going to help, right? It's going to exacerbate the problem. So knowing that almost a quarter of a million other NCAA athletes struggle with the same thing that you do, it's much easier to accept that moment or accept that adversity, and then take some steps to address it. Um, the other thing that I love that you pointed out all those definitions because it certainly shows that problem with future thinking. And I want to reiterate, like you said, performance anxiety comes out of a need for safety, right? So it makes sense that we're going to think about the worst case scenario so that we're prepared for it, right? It's plan for the worst, hope for the best.
Mhm.
That's how we're evolutionarily wired. And so, as you said, that if all those tenured professors are thinking about the absolute worst case scenario, they're probably doing things that will prevent that from happening, right? They're doing things that will protect their career in the future. So, again, being acceptance of that, accepting of that idea that it's a process that's trying to protect you. It's something there to help you work with it, not against it. So those are the few things that I heard that I think are really important. So
Mhm.
you're not alone in the struggle, right? There's a lot of athletes that struggle with it, and there's a very deep-seated evolutionary reason why that happens, right? It's not something wrong with you. It's something that most people experience at some point or another in their lives because of that evolutionary foundation.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, maybe some of the listeners now wondering, like, what do I have performance anxiety? What does that look like? So I think it's helpful to maybe talk about some of, symptoms or things that happen when you're feeling anxious before big performances. And I think we'll break it down into two different kinds of categories. The first one being like the physical symptoms. So what are those? Those look like your racing heart or like increased heart rate before big events. And we're not talking about like to the point we're talking, I'm referring to the point of where your heart's racing so fast it feels like it's going to pound out, like beat out of your chest.
Hmm.
We want you to be a little excited before an event. If you're
Sure.
under aroused, you're probably not going to do too well, depending on your event, obviously. Um, so to the point where like your heart's pumping too fast, where it's going to inhibit performance. The other ones are muscle tension. So are you going in like feeling really tense before big performances? Are you unable to do your movements fluidly, whether that's swimming in the pool, playing on the basketball court, soccer field, wherever that ends up being? Are you able to move freely, or do you feel like you're so tense from the anxiety that it's hard to do that? Difficulty breathing is another one, kind of coincides with the heart rate. So are you over breathing, under breathing? Restlessness. So are you have difficulty sitting still? If you're sitting down, are you kind of, you're shaking your feet and your legs too much? Are you fidgeting with your hands? These aren't necessarily things that make you anxious. They might just be things that you do. But all these together are signs that we should consider. And then sweating, hot flashes. Obviously, if you're doing an intense warm up, you're going to be sweating. So we're talking about maybe before you do any physical exercise, are you starting to get like sweaty palms? Is your back starting to get a little hot? Are you starting to sweat there? These are the physical symptoms that we're referring to. With the mental symptoms, are you having difficulty focusing and concentrating? Are your thoughts only on the future event that's coming up? What are we focusing on? Normally, I think before big performances, it would be on like performing really well, or like what's your job? What's your role today? How do you think you're going to perform well? I think when we're nervous, we're focusing on us, and it's all internalized anxiety. So you start overthinking and ruminating on maybe what you think the bad event's going to be, or how well you're not going to perform. So it usually results in like difficulty being able to relax, a loss of confidence. So maybe you're not walking out with your chest pumped up, your shoulders are down a little bit. Maybe kind of similar to what we were seeing with the Chiefs that we talked about earlier in the podcast, whereas the Eagles were representing the opposite of that. And if it's something that kind of occurs even the day before a big event or the night before a big event, are you having difficulty sleeping as well? As we know, sleep is so important to our performance and our well-being. And if we're not able to do that, it's going to be hard to perform our best. What I will like to emphasize right now, since we talked about the symptoms, if these happen on like a regular basis outside of big performances, I would recommend going to see a professional for help because that's to the point where it's affecting things that just outside of sports. So just to throw that in there while we're talking about it. I know that's not the point of this podcast, but just to mention that as well. If you're feeling these outside of sport, now's probably the time to maybe get more in-depth help. Um, so those are the symptoms that we're referring to in performance anxiety. Ian, is there anything that's coming up for you hearing that?
Yeah, thank you for mentioning the mental health aspect of things. That's part of your specialty, and it's definitely important to keep athletes mentally healthy and ready to perform well. And that's mental health is part and parcel with what we do here, mental performance wise. So yeah, thank you for pointing out those symptoms. I think the things you're mentioning are part of that sympathetic nervous system response. A lot of people will know that as the fight or flight response. Um, it's again, it's that evolutionary response to keep you safe, right? It's your body's kind of red line emergency button, nuclear option. Let's we need to run away or we need to fight the stressful event that's coming. Um, and so a lot of the things that come with that, like you mentioned, in general, what your body is trying to do is increase its readiness to either run away or to fight. So you're increasing your heart rate, you're pushing blood to your extremities, right? You're trying to get ready. So, or pushing blood to your core. So a lot of people experience kind of clammy hands and things like that because your body, again, it's that evolutionary fight or flight response. You're preparing for that big event. Some other things excuse me, that I noticed as far as prolonged fight or flight response. A lot of people sometimes find themselves in this state days leading up to performance. Like you said, if you're having trouble sleeping, it can also disrupt your digestion. So even if you're eating, really good meals before a performance, if you're too stressed and you're in this sympathetic nervous system response, your body isn't absorbing the nutrients that you need to perform. So, as with everything that we do, something that happens in the mind can really have a, a long ripple effect to other things, whether that be, your body's nutrition, whether it be sleep, whether it be, your social network, right? You might get irritable. That's something that comes a lot with chronic anxiety. If you're irritable, you're not nice to your coach, and then all of a sudden you don't get the playing time, right? Like there's a lot of things that can happen from this response. So, knowing the symptoms, kind of having a name for it, and then we'll talk here about some different tools that once you recognize you're approaching this state, maybe some things to bring you down. So, Anthony, what are some of your recommendations for an athlete in this state?
Yeah, I think when I'm talking to athletes about this, one thing I try to emphasize and hopefully it gets home is that thoughts aren't real. They're just thoughts. So if you find that a lot of your thoughts induce this performance anxiety, hopefully this provides some peace of mind for you, is that you can think whatever you want. That doesn't necessarily mean it's true. I can think that I can't put my arms up, but here I am putting them up right now. So if we're able to recognize that the thoughts we're having have no truth, there's no fact behind them, just because that we think them. So, and if we're able to see that, maybe we can observe our thoughts a little bit more than being attached to our thoughts and putting so much value on them. And the other thing is the brain doesn't recognize the word no. So when you are thinking about your performances, and maybe if you're thinking about them negatively, when you say, I hope I do well to, or I hope I don't play bad, or I hope I don't miss these shots, or don't do this, don't do that. All you're doing is just telling your brain to do that because it doesn't recognize the word no. Just like the classic example of if I tell you don't think of pink elephants, what do? You think of pink elephants. It applies to the same thing in any sport. So if you're golfing and you say, I don't hit it in the water, you're essentially just telling yourself to hit it in the water. So finding a way to maybe reframe these thoughts or to find a different way of thinking or just observing the thoughts is, I think, a really good place to start.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I work with I have worked with a number of kind of pre-high school athletes recently. And I've asked them, like, what are you thinking when you perform? And a lot of them are like, I'm not thinking about anything. Like, I don't feel anything. I'm not thinking about anything. And it's like, well, you probably are. Maybe you're just not like in tune with what that is, right? Like if you miss a shot, your body immediately gets like, you feel negative, right? You have negative thoughts. So, like you said, being in tune with what that looks like. And so if you notice that uh, kind of flurry of thoughts that often comes with the sympathetic nervous system, right? Racing thoughts.
Mhm.
There's a way to kind of pull back out of that. Uh, One of my favorite expressions, and it might be counterintuitive, when I was swim coaching, people would come up to me all the time and they'd say, I feel tired today, right? And it's like, I'd always say, well, the sport's called swimming, not feeling, right? It doesn't matter how you feel, it's time to swim. And that's kind of the same thing. So sometimes, like you said, you have to let the thoughts go rather than internalize and identify with them. You need to focus on what you do. And I think this was something that you mentioned a couple of weeks ago to me, but like if your internal dialogue was a teammate, is it helpful or hurtful? Right? If is it a good teammate or a bad teammate? And the nice thing is you're able to kick that teammate off your team if you need to, right? You're able to move your thoughts somewhere else. So I think that's great that kind of mindfulness of your own thinking, and then also being able to redirect externally into some other things. Um, Maybe what are some other kind of short-term relaxation techniques that you've used in the past?
Yeah, I think, we've talked about breathing on here a lot. So I don't think we need to necessarily go over that again. But, depending on what sport you're in, you can do it during competition. You can do it before. I think, if you're swimming, I wouldn't recommend changing your breathing style for
Sure.
safety purposes. Um, but, if you're playing a different sport where it's maybe more start stop, you can incorporate breathing into your ability to relax, or even just using a quick, like, little progressive muscle relaxation. So like tightening and then loosening the muscles in your body. I know a lot of the scripts and maybe audio clips that you hear or practice online are 5, 10, 15, 20 minutes long. You don't necessarily have to do that before a big event, as you probably don't have time to do that either. So if you just kind of tense your muscles and then let them go, that'll help with relaxation a little bit as well, because you're not going to be as tense by doing that. And it's not going to look like anything unusual either. Tensing and loosening your muscles. If you're afraid of people watching you, it's something that happens a lot in sport and warm-ups as well. And I think, finding something that grounds you. If you're feeling like super, super tense and really anxious, a lot of the times your athletic trainer, your strength and conditioning coach, whatever staff you have available at the games will have an ice pack. Put a nice piece of ice in your hand. It will send a shock to your system. It'll help your thoughts stop racing so much. And then what I recommend is using, I think we call it the five senses technique.
Hmm.
So what is that? That's like we want you to incorporate your five senses. So now that you're out of your head because of the ice pack, the shock, use your five senses to ground yourself back in the moment. So, five things you can see, four things you can touch, three that you can hear, two that you can smell, and one that you can taste. Smell and taste at your own risk. I would say, taste like the water maybe that the team has for you. And then maybe try a quick just breathing exercise. So it's kind of we're progressively trying to relax the body, get out of our heads and back into the moment in the here and now.
Yeah, I love that, and I especially like the idea of that targeted PMR, that targeted progressive muscle relaxation. Find, and this is a recommendation for anyone listening, but like find where you tend to hold stress. A lot of people hold it in their shoulders and neck. Some people, hold it in their hands and their fists, their face, but figure out what is kind of the most effective body part for you to really tense and relax and associate with that idea of relaxing and just do that. Um, for athletes, it can be a body part that is incorporated in your play, right? Like a lineman can use their legs or their forearms, things like that to make it a little bit more sport specific. But I think that's awesome because, like you said, it's very quick. It's something that you can do, in the sideline in just a free moment. I appreciate you mentioning swimming there and how just different sports require different things, right? What might be helpful for a lacrosse player might not be so helpful for someone that does a sport, in the water, for a crew athlete or for a water polo player. So you really have to navigate this very kind of on your own, either with people that know your sport or know the techniques very well, like us, that can apply it to different sports. Um, Let's see, and then the breathing I think is so understated because it's such a a physiological behavior that you can tie some sort of psychological mental thought pattern thought process too that can really transform where you are. That means you can even use it to excite yourself, right? People use power breathing to get yourself more excited, but then using deep diaphragm breathing to calm yourself back down, to stop that sympathetic nervous system response, can be very helpful. um, Lastly, you mentioned the mindfulness technique. I think that is a testament to the first technique that you talked about, which is trying to kind of get out of your own head. The idea of focusing on those external environment factors. So, five things you see, four things you hear, going down the list. It puts you out of your own mind and into the environment. And we are, as athletes, we are embodied creatures. We think with our bodies, right? We don't just calculate and then operate like a computer would, right? We're embodied beings when we perform. And so being embodied, getting yourself into that environment can be incredibly powerful. So, creating reset buttons, like you said, that targeted progressive muscle relaxation, some mindfulness techniques associated with breathing, relaxation or exciting breathing techniques can be really really helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, just to reemphasize, the time to maybe practice them is not before the big performance. Like we've talked about before, try it at like a practice before a big game, or do it in, find a quiet space, maybe in the locker room to practice some of the stuff. I think it's helpful to practice it at the scene and the environment where it might take place,
Mhm.
but to do it under like intense, stressful conditions might not get the result that you're expecting. Just as an FYI, if somebody's looking to incorporate these. So it's always important to start small and then work big, just like any other skill that you're probably developing in your sport. You wouldn't try to come out and do a 360 dunk the first time that you could do it, or you wouldn't want to try to do a new skill without really honing it in.
Yeah.
And it's not to say that breathing might not calm you down in the moment, but you just might not know what it feels like to have the breathing done in the moment. So, you know, I don't. It's always, you can always try it in the moment, but I think it's better to start, when things are maybe less intense and there's less consequences involved.
Absolutely, and through that process of neuroplasticity, all these techniques get easier as you get better, the more you train. And so, just like a bicep curl, your ability to relax yourself is a skill that will improve over time. You hear anecdotal evidence of like Buddhist monks being able to control their heart rate, just by meditating and thinking about it. So, as with everything, there's levels to this stuff. And so, start small, start with the basics, see if you can, just calm yourself down after a practice, right? So you're slightly elevated, maybe not in this fight or flight response, but it's time to, lower your energy levels for whatever comes after training. Start there and then build it out to then, when you're competing on the Olympic stage in the future, you're able to control those nerves rather than be overwhelmed by the moment.
Hmm.
Awesome. Well, I think that wraps up the idea of performance anxiety. As always, we want to be resources for anyone listening. So, if this brought up any thoughts of your own experience or questions that you might have, please reach out. Our email will be down in the link, but we are happy to answer any questions that you might have. And before we go, we want to kick off season two with something new. So, we're going to introduce each podcast a mental fitness challenge. So these will be short, small techniques that you can implement throughout your month, in between our podcasts, and kind of try out some of these techniques and see if you like them, see if you want to incorporate them in your own life. But I will let Anthony take off our very first one here today, and for the upcoming month.
Yeah, I think the one that we want to start off with is kind of a confidence building exercise. So I think when we think about confidence, it doesn't necessarily, you don't need to wait to have a great performance to be confident. I really want to emphasize that. So, what can we do to start building our confidence? So, if you're an athlete, chances are you're probably training almost every day, if not every day. So, with the idea being that write down three things that you did really well today to help make you a better athlete or to help boost your confidence. Even if you had a bad practice or a bad performance, there's still something in there that you did well. So the idea behind this is that we're going to build a bank, and the more, just like with money, the more money you put in, the greater return you're going to have long term. So the more that times that you recognize the things that you're doing well, the greater confidence you're going to have in your abilities to perform well. So take some time before bed each night or during the day, whenever you have time, and just write down three things that you did well today. And then when we have our next podcast, it's maybe not that, probably in like a month or so. That's a good time to check in and see all the great things that you've done and how much more confident you can feel in your abilities.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the idea of recognizing your own, little victories can go a long way. We're very often very negative minded, and so we focus and ruminate on, the things that we messed up, right? The wave that was meant for the person behind you, or whatever embarrassing thing you did that day. That's what we tend to think about, and you don't necessarily think about, all of the successes and wins that you had. That so I think that's awesome. So the task for the month. Each day, we want to write down three things that you did well, that you were proud of. Write it down next to the date, and then, in a month's time, you should have a pretty long, robust list, and it should be something that can help boost your confidence in the future.
Hmm.
Absolutely. Well, Anthony, as always, thank you very much for your time and your expertise. Good luck with the student athletes out there at Marist, as well as the athletes that you're working with through the Mental Barbell.
Thank you so much. You too, Ian.